Yeah, welcome to the Science History Institute's Joseph Priestley Society lecture series. I'm Charlie Alcorn, and we'll be making introductions today. Our moderator will be Maria Macciacchini, founder, president, and CEO of Novus Bio. Dr. Macciacchini has a PhD in biochemistry from the Biocenter of Basel and a 2-year visiting fellowship at the Rockefeller University. She did postdocs at Caltech and Roche Institute of Immunology. And Novus Bio is a clinical stage drug development company, which has recently completed a phase 2/3 study in Alzheimer's disease and a phase 3 study in Parkinson's disease, and is engaged in discussions with the FDA. Please join us in our discussion today by typing your questions into the Q&A panel, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Maria will be reviewing those as we go along, and we will address all questions at the end of the presentation. We're thrilled to welcome Holly Fernandez today. She's an associate professor of medical ethics and law at the University of Pennsylvania. She is trained as a bioethicist and lawyer. Her scholarship includes clinical research ethics and regulation, access to investigational medicines, and FDA pharmaceutical policy. Her testimony before the United States Senate Special Committee on Aging last October regarding rare, progressive, and serious diseases provided interesting insights on the challenges created by focused patient advocacy. Recent drug approval controversies suggest the need for caution when assessing the push to further loosen standards. Again, I invite you to put your questions into the Q&A panel. Holly, welcome. Please begin.
Well, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. Christine, can you allow me to share my slides? There we go. All right. How does that look? Can someone give me a thumbs up if you can?
Perfect.
Okay. Okay, perfect. Well, great. Thanks again for inviting me to give this lecture, which I've titled Drug Regulation When Patients Can't Wait, which unfortunately describes the situation for many patients and their families who are facing terrible diseases without good treatment options. And so let me just give you a quick overview about what I'm hoping we can cover over the next 40 minutes or so. I want to talk to you a bit about FDA's history and the way that the pendulum has shifted over time in this balance between speed and certainty. I'm going to give you some insight into a particular pathway to FDA approval called accelerated approval, some of the challenges around that pathway, which is intended to get promising drugs to patients as quickly as possible, as well as some recent reforms. Talk about other types of regulatory flexibility, but then really get to the key takeaway message, which is why we ought to be worried as patients and as a society more broadly about weakened FDA approval standards. And then thinking about kind of the balance between what's good and important for people who are facing disease today, as well as people who are likely to face that disease in the future. All right, so this is a snapshot of a drug advertisement that ran in the late 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s. I'm mixing up my centuries here, for a product called Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. And this was really a cure-all for fussy babies, marketed widely across the country. And its primary ingredients were morphine and alcohol. Thousands of children were believed to have died as a result of receiving this medication. A teaspoonful of the syrup would have contained enough morphine to kill the average child. And, you know, this is just one of many examples of dangerous products that were allowed on the market before we had regulatory oversight, right? So we had dangerous products. We had products that were snake oil, didn't do anything, right? But would take people's money with wild claims of various benefits. And so the FDA exists to prevent exactly that kind of thing. A very brief overview of a century of FDA regulation is presented on this slide. So if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, Congress gives the precursor to FDA the authority to prohibit companies from selling things that are adulterated or misbranded, meaning that they're, contaminated with bad things. They are not disclosing their ingredients, or they're making wild claims about their products, right? This was not at the time a requirement to show safety and effectiveness, not a requirement to get pre-approval, just the most basic standard. Tell people what's in your product and don't lie about it. And then we see a history of FDA that's informed by tragedy. So Congress gives additional authority in response to another medicine that killed a number of children, unfortunately. This is known as the elixir of sulfanilamide tragedy, in which a company transitioned from a powdered form of a drug to a liquid form of the drug in order to make it easier for children to take. But the solvent they used was diethylene glycol, an ingredient found in antifreeze, which is not something, obviously, that you want in your medicines. And so Congress responded by giving authority to say, first, before products are allowed on the market, they have to prove they are safe. And you need to wait for the government to give you permission before you can put your product on the market. We fast forward a couple of decades, in the 1960s, we have another tragedy, thalidomide, a drug that was approved in Europe and prescribed for morning sickness in pregnant women and causes congenital abnormalities in the babies that are born to pregnant people who take that drug. That drug was not approved in the US, thanks to an FDA reviewer who said, we don't have the safety evidence that we need to grant approval to that drug. Even though that was a safety concern, it opened a policy window in which Congress said, we need to give FDA more authority here. And that's where we got our requirement for drugs to have to be proven safe and effective before they would be allowed on the market. And you have to submit an application to FDA, and you have to wait. Until FDA sends that approval letter, you cannot market your drug. And that standard of safety and effectiveness we'll talk about more, but that has been the standard for drug approval in this country since the 1960s. And so this historical trajectory up until that point in the 1960s was that we were getting increasing certainty about drugs that are allowed on the market. As a population, we could be more confident that the drugs that were being sold were going to help us and were not going to harm us. But in order to prove safety and effectiveness, you need to do trials. That takes time. And that means we were seeing decreased speed to market. So we have this tension between speed and certainty. Now, I always like to emphasize the importance of requiring FDA pre-approval, right? You can't get your drug on the market until FDA gives you the green light. One benefit of that is it just keeps unsafe and ineffective products out of people's hands and off the market. You might call that paternalist. Even if you want to take something that hasn't been demonstrated safe and effective, you're not allowed to. And some people bristle at that. I think it's a good thing, right, that we're protecting people against bad outcomes. But if you don't like that rationale, there are plenty of others to choose from. Another is, as patients or clinicians who are prescribing drugs to patients, there is no way that we would have the time or capacity to go through all of the data that FDA goes through when it's confirming that a drug is safe and effective. I often like to share the story that before product marketing applications were submitted electronically to FDA, they were submitted in paper, and you would have tractor trailers full of binders of data that were to support FDA marketing approval. It's just a huge amount of information that these reviewers are going through. And so because they are doing that, the rest of us have a nice heuristic to say, well, if FDA thought it was good enough, I can feel confident prescribing it to my patients. Or if someone's prescribed it to me, I can feel confident taking it, right? So it's addressing that information asymmetry. FDA also has the ability through pre-approval to keep other products off the market. So in addition to patent protection, FDA can grant exclusivity to various types of products. So if you have a new chemical entity that gets approved for a particular use, you get exclusivity for that for a number of years, during which time FDA will not approve a competitor. And that's good for innovation. We could go into a lot of discussion about how much time we should allow products to have that monopoly, but it's intended to allow companies to recoup their investment, which is intended to promote innovation. The bottom one on this slide is the one that I really think is the most important. You cannot market your product until you have convinced FDA through evidence that it is safe and effective. The market does not force that information production. And to see that, go into a vitamin shop or a GNC and look at all the shelves of dietary supplements and vitamins and things. We have no information about whether those are safe and effective because they're not regulated in the same way, right? The market isn't forcing that information to be produced. FDA is forcing that information to be produced. And I'm very happy about that. As a patient, I want to know, right, whether I can rely on these drugs. So those are all the good reasons for requiring pre-approval, but it does create a dilemma, right? We keep the bad stuff off the market, but it means we have slower access to things that are eventually going to be beneficial to people. And we know, right, that during that time window, there are going to be people who literally die because they are not going to have access to something that could potentially be helpful to them. This is something that really motivated the HIV/AIDS activists in the late 80s and early 90s, right? So these more stringent requirements for pre-market approval that were, coming along through the course of the 20th century were met with some pushback, right? And an advocacy effort to say, well, we're going to need some alternative pathways to access these products, even if we're uncertain about them. And so we see, as a response to that activism, the development of something called expanded access. This is a pathway through which patients can take investigational drugs, unapproved drugs, outside of a clinical trial when they're facing a serious and life-threatening disease. And then we also see weakened standards for marketing approval, which I'll go into a lot more detail about. But as I mentioned, right, this was largely influenced by the HIV activists who got FDA to shift their thinking in a really important way. Up until that point in time, FDA had really seen its vision its mission, I should say, as protecting patients from dangerous products. But what the HIV advocates did was get FDA to recognize that there needs to be some balance, right? You can protect patients, but you also need to help them access things that could be beneficial for them. Now, moving away from the HIV advocacy, I do want to just flag another important kind of moment in how FDA thinks about its mission. In the early 2000s, there was some important litigation called Abigail Alliance versus von Eschenbach, who was the FDA commissioner at the time. And Abigail Alliance was an advocacy organization founded by the father of a young woman who you see on the slide here named Abigail Burroughs. Abigail died of cancer at the age of 21, and she and her family had petitioned FDA to grant something called initial approval. This is not something that exists as a pathway, but it was something that they were asking FDA to do. Grant initial approval for promising products intended to treat life-threatening diseases. And they based this petition around an argument that there is a constitutionally protected right for people in mortal peril to try to save their own lives. Basically, let us try things that could be beneficial, even if they haven't met the standard for marketing approval. They sued FDA, arguing that terminally ill patients have this constitutionally protected liberty interest. And there was some dicey moments where the court agreed with them. And ultimately, though, the final outcome of this case, it never made its way to the Supreme Court, but at the DC Circuit Court of Appeals, an en-banc decision, meaning all of the justices on that circuit court determined there is no such constitutionally protected right for terminally ill patients to access unapproved drugs. So they basically said, FDA appropriately is determining which products are allowed on the market, even for really, really bad diseases, okay? Which is important, right, for FDA's existence and everything they do, that they got that decision from the court. But FDA heard kind of the desperation and the push, right, from the terminally ill patient community, and they realized we need to improve our expanded access pathway. We need to help make it more available for people to try things outside of clinical trials, and they have done a very good job of that, making physicians more aware of their expanded access pathway, trying to streamline the burden of submitting these requests, especially in the context of oncology. There's a project at FDA called Project Facilitate, which they describe as a concierge program in which oncologists can call up a specific person at FDA and get some help accessing unapproved drugs for their patients. And I'm happy to talk about that more during the Q&A. So where are we today, right? For much of the 20th century, there wasn't much FDA-related legislation happening, but in the back half of the 20th century, we see a lot of FDA regulation. And I don't have time to go into much detail about this, but I just want to flag kind of the theme of a lot of this legislation was get drugs on the market more quickly. So what we see today is a trend, a very clear trend toward what's called regulatory flexibility, allowing products on the market, even though we aren't totally sure that they're going to be beneficial for patients. So we're seeing that pendulum swing, right? It had gone from, speed to certainty, and now we're back to speed again. Now, to understand how FDA approves drugs, it's important to just recognize the statutory standard, and that is that drugs have to be demonstrated safe through sufficient information, right, provided by the sponsor, and they have to be demonstrated effective for their intended use. And effectiveness is defined by law as substantial evidence that the drug will have its purported effect under the labeled conditions of use. And then that substantial evidence standard gets further defined by statute as evidence consisting of adequate and well-controlled investigations. And that S is highlighted so you can see it's intended to be plural, right? More than one adequate and well-controlled investigation. So the statutory standard is referring both to the quantity and the quality of the evidence that a sponsor needs to submit to FDA in order to be granted marketing approval, but we see flexibility on both counts. So first, we see flexibility about the quantity of substantial evidence. The kind of gold standard, right, is at least 2 adequate and well-controlled investigations. That's what's required for drugs, that treating, male pattern baldness or, the common cold, right? Not things that are affecting patients, terminal illness or serious life-threatening diseases. An alternative standard is that Congress said to FDA, you could also grant approval based on 1 adequate and well-controlled investigation and confirmatory evidence, right? So that would be from something other than an adequate and well-controlled investigation, maybe an observational study without a control group. Maybe it's a study of a similar product, that has the same mechanism of action, but is not quite the same as the one that's seeking approval. Or maybe that confirmatory evidence comes from a related patient population that's not exactly the same. But you can see that's weaker than having 2 adequate and well-controlled investigations. And then there's also the possibility of granting approval based on 1 knock your socks off study, or it's supposed to be a knock your socks off study. And I've got some data I'll share with you about how that standard is being applied in just a moment. So that's flexibility on quantity of evidence. There's also flexibility around the quality of substantial evidence. So here's some language. I hope that yellow is legible to you, but here's a blurb from some draft guidance that FDA put out in 2019, in which they basically say, we would rather approve a drug for a serious disease that doesn't work if we're uncertain about it, then fail to approve a drug that does work, right? We would rather err on the side of approving something that could be beneficial to patients. That's where we see some of this regulatory flexibility come in. And then there's also a whole pathway under which FDA will grant approval to products, even if we're uncertain about their benefit. So this pathway is called accelerated approval, and it's based on a prediction that the drug will offer clinical benefit. So let me tell you a little bit more about what I mean by that. For traditional FDA approval or regular approval, you might even hear this called full approval. We expect companies to demonstrate benefit on clinical endpoints. Clinical endpoints, the easiest way to understand it is, how does the patient feel, function, or survive? These are things that the patient can feel themselves, right? It's not a laboratory test. It's not, a radiographic image. It is something that the patients would notice a difference, okay? That's the best kind of evidence. But under accelerated approval, you can get marketing approval on the basis of an unvalidated surrogate endpoint. And a surrogate endpoint is something other than how the patient feels, functions, or survives. So to give you an example, in cancer, right, we might look at tumor shrinkage rather than survival. In Alzheimer's disease, we might look at reduction of amyloid plaques in the brain rather than slowed down decline of cognitive ability, right? So it's unvalidated, meaning we're not sure that this surrogate will in fact predict clinical benefit. An example of a validated surrogate endpoint would be viral load for HIV, or CD4 counts for HIV, or cholesterol levels for certain diseases, right? But unvalidated surrogates still have uncertainty about whether they're really going to pan out. So that's weaker evidence. Now, because it's a weaker approach to meeting that substantial evidence standard, the accelerated approval pathway may only be used for drugs to treat serious or life-threatening diseases. FDA also requires post-approval studies to verify that that predicted clinical benefit actually takes place, right? So these are called post-market required studies, or PMRs. And we'll talk a bit about some of the challenges associated with those. And then FDA also has the authority to engage in expedited withdrawal. If an accelerated approval drug fails to confirm benefit in a reasonable period of time, they delay their study too long, or that study is done, but it doesn't confirm benefit, FDA can get that drug off the market ostensibly more quickly than they otherwise would be able to. Now, accelerated approval is also something that was a development out of that HIV/AIDS advocacy movement that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So it comes on the scene in 1992. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but what this graph is showing you is that accelerated approval has gone way up in use over the course of the past couple of decades. So the lighter color here represents HIV-related accelerated approvals. The darker color represents oncology accelerated approvals. So you can see by 2020, nearly all of the accelerated approvals that get granted are in oncology. We are seeing now a move to use accelerated approval for rare disease, as well as for novel large markets like Alzheimer's disease. And a quarter of the accelerated approvals that have ever been issued came in 2020 to 2021. This had nothing to do with COVID. The accelerated approvals were not granted for COVID. That's just a signal of how frequently this pathway is being used today. And then we also are hearing from FDA leadership. This is a photo of Peter Marks, who leads the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research, with the headline, "Accelerated approval will be the norm for gene therapies." And in fact, we're starting to see this pathway be used in that context as well. Now, the important thing to understand about accelerated approval is that it's intended as a compromise. Patients get earlier access before we're really sure that the drug works, on the promise that we'll get confirmatory evidence later. We know that not all of these are going to pan out, right? There's going to be some duds because we have that uncertainty. And so then we have to question, well, how should we evaluate success of this program? Is it based on how quickly drugs move to regular approval? Right? Once you do your confirmatory study and it looks like you have proven a clinical benefit, you can get regular approval. Should we base it on how quickly we pull the drugs that fail off the market? There's kind of a set of questions about how would we know whether this compromise is working well. So let me tell you some of the research related to this. Here is a paper from 2018, so it's getting a bit dated, but this one came directly from folks at the Oncology Center for Excellence at FDA. And they basically conclude that over 25 years of using accelerated approval, the pathway has been a success. And they say, look at all of these products that have gotten accelerated approval. More than half of them have verified benefit, and only 5% of them have been withdrawn. And so they say, look, success, right? But it turns out that those that verified benefit may not have really confirmed benefit in ways that we think are meaningful, right? So only a small fraction of them verified benefit in terms of overall survival, and many of them still had not completed their requirements or verified benefit. This is a more recent study. It just came out from my colleagues a couple of months ago. They looked specifically at cancer oncology approvals that had more than 5 years of follow-up. If you think, oh, how long is it going to take to get this confirmatory study done? Makes sense to kind of go back 5 years so that they would have time to get those done. They found that 2/3 of them had in fact moved from accelerated to regular approval, but fewer than half of them demonstrated clinical benefit, right? And so again, that's the thing we really care about. How do patients feel, function, or survive? And we're seeing these drugs move into full approval without the benefit of that really strong evidence. Now, I am a supporter of the accelerated approval pathway. We have lots of examples of great drugs that got to patients sooner. The column here is marked time to verification of benefit. Another way to read that is that's how much more quickly these good drugs got to patients than if we had waited. There's some complexity around that, but as a good heuristic, we can see a long list of, this is just cancer drugs that are beneficial to patients. On the other hand, we also see that many patients get exposed to drugs that turn out not to work. So this is a snapshot from a paper that came out from some of my colleagues recently, and they looked at 5 types of cancer, and they looked at the new treatment initiations in those patients. And they found that 1/4 of these treatment initiations involved an accelerated approval indication that was subsequently withdrawn due to lack of benefit. Okay, so it's 1/4 of those patients are getting something that turned out not to work. There are some other concerns about the pathway. Confirmatory studies are often given a long time to get done. They experience substantial delay in some cases. And even when they are completed, they often lack rigorous design characteristics, things that would make us feel really confident that if they show benefit, we can believe that benefit. And they often, kind of the summation is the data to confirm benefit is often less good than we would hope it would be. FDA has sometimes been reticent to pull accelerated approval products off the market if the studies are delayed or if they turn out not to demonstrate benefit. And the reason for that is if nothing better has come along, FDA might be getting a lot of pressure to just leave that product on the market because maybe some portion of the patient population feels like it's working for them, even if the data don't really support that. So one thing that I would love to talk about a bit more during the Q&A is whether the incentives are appropriately aligned around this compromise, right? Early access, and then we've got to confirm benefit as quickly as possible. But if you're a company who's gotten accelerated approval, getting your confirmatory study done quickly and well doesn't get you very much. Your product is already marketed. You can, get insurers to cover it. You can charge, the price that you set on the market. Doing your confirmatory study can either maintain the status quo, best case scenario, you confirm benefit and you can keep doing what you were already doing, or worst case scenario, fails to demonstrate that your drug works, in which case you lose, right? So companies may not have the best incentives. Patients may have very little reason to enroll in these post-market studies if their doctors will prescribe them the drug and their insurers will cover it. It's just more burden for them to participate in a clinical study. So that that compromise, I think, is really in tension here. And then the other challenge is that this is not free, right? So the grids that you see at the top here came from an Office of the Inspector General analysis that was released a couple of years ago in 2022. The lighter blue box is showing that about 40% of the accelerated approval drug applications had incomplete confirmatory studies. Now, some of them might be still within the range that it's reasonable. They haven't finished their studies yet. But the darker blue grid shows that a third have incomplete confirmatory trials past their deadline, right? So these are late, and those drugs are costing the government a ton of money. So the circles that you see at the bottom of the screen here is looking at just a couple of years of data from 2018 to 2021. And it's showing that Medicare and Medicaid spent $18 billion on accelerated approval drugs that had late confirmatory studies just in that short window of time, $18 billion. So what we see, right, is that weak approval standards and weak post-approval standards mean that what we might be getting is a lot of expensive and unproven drugs, right? That's not what patients really want or are advocating for. So let's look at a couple of examples here. You may have seen coverage of Aduhelm or aducanumab because it got a lot of mainstream media coverage, front page of the New York Times coverage, because this was one of the first drug approvals for. There were other, drugs for symptoms of Alzheimer's disease and that kind of thing, but this was one of the big approvals for an Alzheimer's disease drug. So we go back to think about the data supporting aducanumab. The company Biogen did two randomized controlled phase 3 studies that were looking at whether their drug had an impact on slowing cognitive decline. And in the middle of those studies, they realized if we keep going, we're still not going to be able to prove that these drugs impact cognitive decline. So they stopped the two studies early for what's called futility, right? Even if we kept going, it's not going to be able to get us to show benefit. But then they kept looking at their data after the studies were ended. And they did what's, post hoc analysis, meaning it wasn't pre-planned. And when they looked at some subgroups, in one of the two studies, they saw some evidence that maybe there was clinical benefit in a high dose group in one of the studies. But what was also very clear was that this drug is effective in reducing amyloid plaque in the brain. Now, I am not a clinician. I'm a lawyer and bioethicist by training, but my understanding is that this hypothesis that amyloid plaque in the brain, reduction of amyloid plaque in the brain could also improve, cognitive status, or at least slow cognitive decline. That hypothesis was kind of on the way out the door. It had been studied for a number of years, hadn't really panned out. This was not a validated surrogate. It had never before been used to support an Alzheimer's drug approval. And there were some serious safety concerns about this drug. So FDA called together a panel of independent external advisors called an advisory committee, and that committee unanimously recommended that FDA not approve aducanumab. And there was some discussion about accelerated approval at the time, and would you consider approving this on the basis of the fact that it does reduce amyloid plaque in the brain? The advisory committee was told, nope, accelerated approval is not even being considered here. So the advisory committee went poorly for the company, for Biogen. And after the advisory committee, which is held publicly, you can watch advisory committee meetings, you can look at all of the public comments and the materials that are presented there. So everybody knew that this meeting had gone poorly. FDA then held a private meeting that had been requested by Alzheimer's patient advocates who were concerned about how that advisory meeting had went, who wanted FDA to grant approval for this drug. So this is a quote that you see in the black and red here from several FDA officials who were responsible for granting aducanumab's approval. And they say, listen, we talked directly to some patients and their families about this disease, and they made it clear that they are willing to accept the trade-off. There's uncertainty about benefit. They don't have anything better. They would rather us grant early approval for this drug, even with uncertainty. And so they did. So FDA granted accelerated approval. Biogen initially priced its drug at $56,000 a year because Alzheimer's disease affects so many patients. Medicare increased its annual premium to cover the costs of this new drug on the market. And then all hell broke loose. Some physicians said the evidence isn't good enough. We're not going to prescribe. Some payers said we're not going to pay for this. I'm happy to talk about that a bit more during the Q&A, but it's an interesting example that just highlights FDA is the first gatekeeper, but there are other gatekeepers that if they're not convinced by the data, right, like the prescriber and the insurer, they also have to be convinced by these data. So ultimately, what has happened around Alzheimer's disease in the wake of this accelerated approval is that there have been other monoclonal antibodies approved for Alzheimer's disease, including lecanemab, which originally was granted accelerated approval, also based on the reduction of amyloid plaques in the brain, and then ultimately got regular approval, as well as a drug called donanemab, another monoclonal antibody that got regular approval recently. Now, these drugs demonstrated some statistically significant clinical benefit, but that magnitude of benefit might be so small that patients and their families and their doctors might not even notice it. Okay, so there's a difference between something that's statistically significant and clinically meaningful. And there are important questions about whether those drugs are actually doing much for patients. And they all have these important safety concerns around brain bleeds, brain swelling, and that kind of thing. Once these other drugs have come on the market, and the additional pushback around aducanumab, Biogen has decided to withdraw aducanumab from the market in the next couple of months. So on the one hand, you might say, well, it's a success, right? We had this first accelerated approval. It opened the door for these other products that may have some clinical benefit. On the other hand, a skeptic like me might say, well, we do have more drugs on the market, but we don't know that those drugs are good for patients, and they are very expensive products. So, if we think about how to rebalance the scale here, I think it's fair to say that accelerated approval is an important pathway, but we need to adjust the back end of the compromise. We need to make sure that those post-market studies are done well, done quickly, and that we pull drugs off the market if they don't actually confirm benefit. There has been some recent progress on this front, prompted by concern over what happened with aducanumab. Congress passed a piece of legislation at the end of 2022 that was intended to address some of these shortfalls that I've mentioned around accelerated approval. So, for example, FDA can now require confirmatory studies to be underway before accelerated approval is granted, which unsurprisingly has been shown to move drugs more quickly to actually confirm benefit or fail to do so we can deal with them more quickly. And there has been some payer pushback. The Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services put some important constraints about whether they would be willing to pay for these monoclonal antibodies for Alzheimer's disease. FDA has really stepped up its game, pushing companies to either voluntarily withdraw or forcing withdrawal in some recent examples, and that has moved along more quickly. So positive trajectory, I think, in response to some of these concerns about accelerated approval, but we're not out of the woods yet. And I also just wanted to flag that accelerated approval is not the only type of regulatory flexibility. So there are some data now indicating that FDA pretty often allows drugs on the market even when they miss their primary endpoints. So the things that the studies were designed around that would demonstrate benefit, even if they don't in fact do that, FDA is still often willing to allow those products to come on the market. And FDA has increasingly accepted less data in support of marketing approval. So in 2022, 2/3 of the drugs that FDA approved were granted approval on the basis of just one pivotal study. Now, one response to that is to say, okay, well, if we're going to allow drugs on the market with more uncertainty, let's make sure we're getting those confirmatory studies done. Confirmatory studies, these post-market studies, are really only required for efficacy for accelerated approval drugs. And so with colleagues, I've argued that FDA should be requiring post-market studies more broadly, even outside of the accelerated approval context. And here's an example of how this might work. This is a drug called Relivrio. It's a drug for amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, which is a terrible, universally fatal neurodegenerative disease. A company called Amylyx was pursuing this drug, and they had a positive phase 2 study. They demonstrated clinical benefit, but it was just one study, and it wasn't necessarily a knock your socks off study. So they said, well, look, it's a terrible disease. We've got some good evidence here. We'd like FDA to accept our marketing application. So they talked to FDA. They wanted to submit their application, and FDA said, no, we're really going to need you to do a phase 3 study first. So the company went ahead and did that. And then in the midst of them doing their phase 3 study, FDA said, no, you know what? We'll accept your marketing application now, even though your phase 3 isn't done. And this was in response to some really substantial patient advocacy from the ALS community. Two leading ALS advocacy organizations, the ALS Association and IMALS, submitted thousands of signatures calling on FDA to approve the drug. They met with agency officials and ultimately praised FDA for accepting the marketing application. I don't have time to go into the details, but there were 2 advisory committees around this drug with lots of activism from patients saying, we want FDA to approve this drug. And ultimately, FDA granted approval on the basis of that phase 2 study. This was not accelerated approval. It was regular approval because they had demonstrated some clinical benefit in that phase 2 study. The company marketed the drug at $158,000 a year, and it promised FDA that they would do their phase 3 study. Now, Europe refused to grant approval until that phase 3 study was done. So there was some confidence that the company would have enough incentive to get it done. Ultimately, what happened was that phase 3 study didn't demonstrate benefit. And to the company's credit, it pretty quickly pulled the drug from the market. It's just 1 month from the top line results coming out to the company voluntarily withdrawing approval. I am running out of time. I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. If there's anybody in the audience who's interested in Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, this is another area where we see lots of patient advocacy that really does seem to be influencing FDA to grant early approvals, even when companies have not demonstrated that their products are beneficial. So sometimes there's an argument that maybe FDA should be even more flexible, right? As long as we have patients who are dying from their diseases with no good treatment options, maybe FDA should be more flexible. I say no. FDA has already shown itself to be very flexible, and there's some concerns about allowing products to come on the market too soon. For patients today, they are not going to know whether these drugs are beneficial. Some patients might be willing to accept that uncertainty, but those that would like to have more uncertainty aren't going to have it. Now, sometimes you hear patients say, well, if I don't have anything better, I may as well try this. I'm dying anyway. But you can lose important opportunities from trying a drug that doesn't work. Maybe you could be in a trial of a drug that works better. Maybe you could avoid the side effects of something that's ultimately not going to be beneficial. But I'm also really concerned about what this means for patients tomorrow. And what I mean by that is, future patients who are going to be no better off by virtue of having more drugs on the market, but no certainty about whether those drugs are beneficial. And this goes back to what I was saying about FDA as a forcer of information production, right? FDA sets the industry incentives. The industry is going to produce the produce the information that FDA demands, and it doesn't have the incentive to produce the information that FDA doesn't demand. And so if we are lowering our approval standards, we're going to get more drugs, but not necessarily better drugs. And it becomes difficult to study new drugs because it's hard to convince people to be in those studies. Your design gets muddied because you have to include those early drugs that didn't confirm benefit yet. And so we have this kind of downstream domino effect that actually can have a bad impact for patients tomorrow. And all of this, as I mentioned, has a really substantial financial impact. So where I'm going to close is just by flagging that the HIV advocates, some of them saw the writing on the wall as early as the mid-90s. So here are some quotes from a letter to the FDA commissioner about accelerated approval of an early antiretroviral for HIV. And some members of the HIV advocacy community were worried that there wasn't enough evidence to support this drug. And they raised some concerns about accelerated approval itself, saying that maybe this standard is actually penalizing people with terrible disease because their drugs are going to be held to an inappropriately low standard. And they also said, look, we've learned from experience, the HIV advocates, that we can't depend on industry to produce the information that's necessary to make life or death treatment decisions. FDA has to force them to do that. And some HIV advocates are urging patients today to learn from their prior experience, recognizing that patients need access to drugs that work, right? Not just access and hope, but access and answers. And we're starting to see some emergence of patient advocacy from the perspective of the future, right? So this is a woman named Jean Swidler. She's active on social media and is public about her status as a gene carrier for ALS. Huge family history in her family of this disease. And she basically says, we can't give in to short-sighted urges to offer something instead of nothing. We need industry to feel urgency. They shouldn't get paid until they deliver, right? So we're not going to pay your high prices until you prove your drugs work. This is a patient advocate, a mother of a child with Duchenne's, who at a public meeting took the company Sarepta to task to say, look, you've gotten approval for this gene therapy. You haven't delivered any of this evidence you're supposed to have for your $3.2 million drug. We are the people who give you the millions of dollars, but you're not giving us facts, data, and science. You're just taking the money. So we're seeing some pushback here. This pendulum between speed and certainty. There's tension in the patient community. Some patients really want FDA to be more flexible. Some are saying, wait a minute, we need to know that these drugs actually work. So this is where I will end, right? As we think about the modern role for patient advocacy is to be really sensitive and careful about what will happen if we further weaken the standards for approval. And really the strongest advocacy should be demanding strong evidence to guide treatment decisions, right? Insisting on rigorous, rapid confirmatory studies following accelerated approval, pushing FDA and companies to get bad drugs off the market, and understanding when payers say, we're not going to pay, or we're not going to pay full price until we've really confirmed benefit. And just recognizing this tension sometimes between the interests of patients today and the interests of patients to come. So with that, I am happy to close and take some questions.
Thank you so much, Holly, for a really beautiful talk. I'm really impressed by your talk. Thank you. So yes, let's go to questions. I think one of the first questions I saw is, where did it go? Yeah, who decides what gets accelerated approval? Now, you've pointed out patient advocacy groups. You also pointed out cancer, which is a deadly disease. What exactly makes the FDA go for accelerated approval?
Yeah.
Or does it depend?
Yeah, well, so it's not something that patients can say, like, this one should get accelerated approval and this one shouldn't. It's a statutory standard. And it really is something that companies work with FDA to decide as they're designing their clinical trials. So if you think we can prove that this drug has a benefit on a surrogate, and we want to get it to patients more quickly, then you would engage with FDA and say, we're going to design our pivotal studies to examine a surrogate endpoint rather than a clinical endpoint. And FDA would say, okay, we'll accept that surrogate endpoint. Go ahead and do your studies that way. And if you demonstrate impact on that surrogate, we'll approve. Now, what happened with aducanumab was what's not supposed to happen, which is that accelerated approval gets used to rescue a drug that was studied for clinical benefit, but failed to demonstrate clinical benefit, right? Because the idea is that you study the surrogate because you can do that more quickly, right? You could evaluate tumor shrinkage more quickly than you could evaluate survival. If you've studied it for a clinical endpoint, then you should go for regular approval. So this is something that really gets worked out between the company and FDA is the ultimate arbiter of whether a drug is eligible for accelerated approval.
Okay, so cancer studies, usually we all agree cancer is deadly, at least most cancers are. Whereas Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or even ALS, they'll kill people in 10, 20, 30 years. So having accelerated approval of a confirmatory study for something that has a very high placebo effect, like all neurodegeneration studies, is a difficult thing to do. How do you see the FDA work with that?
Yeah, so the standard for accelerated approval is not rapidly fatal. It's serious and life-threatening disease or condition. So all of these things, right, Alzheimer's disease included, meets that standard. And in fact, the longer the disease trajectory, the more beneficial accelerated approval might be, because if it takes a long time to die from a disease, then it's going to take a long time to do a study that uses survival as the endpoint, right? But you can do the study more quickly if what you're looking at is, does this drug slow cognitive decline over a period of 6 months? Right? For a disease course that takes longer than that, then you could get your study done more quickly. Interestingly, for those diseases that are rapidly fatal, you might think accelerated approval is not appropriate because you would be able to very quickly evaluate whether the drug has an impact on survival because of the rapidly fatal nature of those diseases.
One question that came in asked about how doctors look at accelerated approval. Are they more skeptical for a drug that has accelerated approval or a drug that has normal approval? Or does it depend on the disease, on the doctor, on how much the patient pushes?
It definitely depends, but there is a bit of empirical evidence about this, which suggests that physicians don't have any idea whether a drug is accelerated or regular approval. There is some labeling, right, that indicates that, but it's not something that is necessarily emphasized in, physician advertising, for example. It's not always obvious to the, run-of-the-mill clinician at a community clinic whether drug A or B has accelerated approval or regular approval. And in fact, FDA has kind of gotten itself in a hard spot because FDA insists that accelerated approval and regular approval are both full approval, because they have both met the substantial evidence of effectiveness standard. And so FDA will insist it's not a weaker standard, it's just a different standard. I take issue with that. I mean, I think it's pretty clearly a weaker standard if we aren't certain about the drug's benefit. But there was a strategy behind that. When accelerated approval first came on the scene, there was worry that insurers would say, this isn't full approval, and so we're not going to pay for it, in which case it's not as helpful to have products come on the market if you are going to just be, patients are not going to be able to pay for them out of pocket. So the fact that FDA insists that they are the same makes it hard for doctors and patients to recognize that they are not the same. Now, that might be a silver lining of all of this media attention to aducanumab, was that the idea of accelerated approval got a lot more attention than it otherwise would have, and maybe would start to raise some eyebrows about whether the evidence was good enough.
Now, you had a slide that showed that we paid, or Medicare paid, $18 billion in accelerated approved drugs that didn't work, something like that.
Yeah.
And you just said that the reason the FDA made accelerated approval or full approval is exactly so that the insurance can pay. Is there a way in between that is being discussed?
Well, this was another outgrowth of the aducanumab debacle. So in response to aducanumab's approval, typically when FDA approves a drug, insurers have to pay for it. It has to go on their formularies. Medicare has to pay for it. There's a little bit of wiggle room in certain domains, but it's the vast majority of cases, it's FDA approved means it gets covered. Now, I said FDA's approval standard is safe and effective. The coverage standard for Medicare is not safe and effective. It's reasonable and necessary for the Medicare population. So normally in a Venn diagram, those would overlap exactly, right? If it's safe and effective, it's going to be reasonable and necessary. But for these monoclonal antibodies, CMS, Medicare, said, we are not convinced that it is reasonable and necessary for this population. So they adopted something called coverage with evidence development,
Yes.
the pretty exceptional approach in which they said, we will only cover accelerated approval monoclonal antibodies for Alzheimer's disease for patients that are participating in a randomized controlled trial. And they said, if you get full approval, then we will cover it for patients who are included in a registry. That caused a lot of consternation in the Alzheimer's community. They said CMS is discriminating against us. You pay for all these oncology drugs with accelerated approval. Now you won't pay for this. There was mixed kind of reaction. That's one example of something that's been tried. Medicare did put out a proposal that they might pay less for accelerated approval drugs, but that has been dropped. It's a very politically challenging question.
Well, thanks. I want to tell you that there are quite a few comments that say you gave a beautiful talk, okay?